Hi everybody, welcome to today's ISE webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by HireVue. I'll get Tom to introduce them in a couple of seconds. Today we'll be discussing hiring for an uncertain future, how to identify your stars of today and tomorrow, an evergreen topic for all of us here at the ISE. My name's Steve Isherwood, I'm Joint Chief Executive of the ISE. Like all ISE webinars, we want to make this as interactive as possible, so please do use the chat function. Please also use the Q&A as well. We've got time at the end, we've got Q&A, so pop anything in there that you want to ask either John or Tom, who will introduce themselves shortly, and I'll come back to those at the end. Also, just so you know, we do record this. So you'll get a recording of this sometime after Zoom's done all its magic. You can record everything and download it, and also some data from HireVue that they'll be sending through. So Tom, why don't you just introduce HireVue for now, just let everybody know a little bit of background to yourselves as an organisation.
Yeah, fantastic. So to HireVue, we are all about connecting talent to opportunity. So we're transforming the way that organisations discover, engage, and then hire the best talent. We work with brands like Just Eat, Santander, and Emirates. They use our video interviewing, our assessment, or our conversational AI solutions to engage candidates in a fair, effective, and valid way. We've hosted more than 36 million interviews, completed more than 7 million assessments, and have hosted more than 200 million chat-based candidate interactions. We recently acquired Modern Hire, which has really strengthened our mission to change lives by connecting talent to opportunity, so using skills, structured and science-based hiring. The combined company now serves 1,150 customers around the world and over half of the Fortune 100, so helping a lot of individuals build high-performing teams and get the job that is well-suited to them.
Great, thanks a lot, Tom. I'll come back in a second and we'll do some proper introductions from yourself and John. So just a bit of background to this webinar. So 2022, for all of those that follow the detail of the ISE annual recruitment survey, for the very first time, the number of employers who actually stipulate a 2-1 degree dropped below half. Which is particularly relevant at the moment because I'm sure a lot of you are trying to work out how to deal with the marking boycotts. But for actually, as I've said in quite a number of interviews I've done recently, and when asked about the subject, that actually it's becoming less and less relevant important for employers. And also, you know, my background, professional services, we always used to use UCAS tariffs actually a lot, even more than degree disciplines, but only 13% of employers now are actually setting a UCAS minimum point tariff, so even fewer than historically. So the balance is tipping in favour of new approaches to early careers recruitment. So we want to ask the question is, what are the trusted selection methods that recruiters are now using and how do you successfully embed them? That's one of the questions that we're going to be getting to on this conversations. So let's do some introductions properly now. John, should we hear from you first? Do you want to just introduce yourselves and share a little bit about what trends you're seeing in the early careers hiring space at the moment?
Yeah, hi Stephen, thanks very much for inviting me on. I'm John Hull, formerly of Balfour Beatty, Carillion, Sodexo, maybe too many to mention, but I've been around the early career space in various organisations for about 10, 12 years now. And it's an interesting market. I think as I was leaving Balfour, the demand for talent was ever increasing. So, and that's both in terms of volume, but the diversity of skills and potential needed felt a bit like, so 3 years ago I was at Nationwide and there was a big sort of push on tech and digital skills. The same could be said now in construction and heavier industry around engineering generally. So that talent, not necessarily, we don't have enough of it in the UK. So how do we train, grow and develop people to build our own infrastructure, right? So I think the challenges are as hard as they've ever been. And then in terms of identifying, I think we're still developing across industries, you know, some are better than others about identifying what is good for our organization and industry. So I think it's you know, how do you sift out or differentiate just based, you know, is it right to do it just based on a degree or degree filter or, you know, degrade that is a marking in a moment in time. So welcome the discussion really.
Yeah, great, we'll go back into that. And we're hearing the same from lots of sectors around volume of vacancies at the moment. I think there's some evidence out there that maybe ad hoc vacancies are reducing, but we did a pulse survey a month or so ago, and we just asked employers what they're hiring. We didn't publish the overall average because averages can be distorting, but it was everything from 0 to 40%, that long-term talent piece. Thanks, John, and we'll get back to the sort of degree grades, etc. in a moment. Tom, do you want to say a little bit more about yourself and also what trends, etc. you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, hi everyone, Tom Cornell. I'm a senior organisational psychology consultant at HireVue, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially I'm involved in the design, implementation and maintenance of our different assessment solutions. So primarily our interview assessments, so we score a candidate's competency-based interview using AI, or our game-based assessments. We present cognitive tests, personality testing in a more engaging format. I've been in the company around 5 years now. I started based out of our London office. I then spent a few years out in Sydney, seeing out COVID on a sunny beach, although still locked down for the most of it, unfortunately. And then I'm now back in Europe, based out of Denmark. So I've implemented, a number of different solutions, quite commonly within the early talent, sort of early careers space, really across the globe.
Right.
I think in terms of trends, I'm seeing, I suspect it's probably resonates with most of you. Of course, the trend we're seeing from our customers is really around getting the same volume of candidates that they previously used to, as well as some challenges around completion rates. I was seeing this down in Australia, a couple of years back. It kind of started to happen, and we're still seeing evidence of that. Organizations aren't getting the same numbers for roles that they used to. I don't think we're seeing it quite so badly in the graduate space. I mean, there's still, of course, the same or similar number of graduates out there looking for roles. I think it's more being felt more heavily in the entry level space, but I do know that some of our graduate customers are seeing some of that challenge. It feels like there's been a bit of a shift in recent years in the kind of that power dynamic between the candidate and the employer. Candidates, I think, are slightly empowered to be a little bit more demanding, and in terms of what they want from the role, in terms of comp and benefits, or being able to work flexibly. But it also, I think, means that they're less forgiving of a prospective employer who gives the wrong impression or a bad impression throughout the hiring process. So I think we have seen a bit of a shift in that dynamic in the last couple of years.
John, just before I ask you the question I was going to ask you, I just wondered what your thoughts are on that buyers or sellers market, because it is something I hear quite often, which is if you're a strong candidate and you've got what an employer needs, you've actually got quite a bit of power in the market.
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with that, and what Tom said. It's the difference between sort of grads and numbers and apprentice application numbers is stark. I think you're right. If you are a strong candidate, whether it's a degree, discipline, or specific particular skill or desire, you are in the driving seat. And I think, as I was exiting Balfour Beatty, we were implementing some digital tools, and I think you're right. If we had candidates, and I'm sure many others are the same, that could come to an assessment event and wait 3-4 months till they heard anything, because we're a manual process and transitioning, which is, we would have a dropout rate of 16-17%, offer decline, which is waste, ultimately wasted work. Whereas if you can get that both speed of process, but the feeling that it is somewhat personal and engaging, then you've got a much better chance of landing your fish, really.
Yeah, you say somebody says no to you and you said yes, that's an awful lot of investment wasted, isn't it? Yeah. So sorry, John, I've digressed slightly off script there. Just go back to the question we started to talk about this at the start, which is that whole thing around the number stipulating 2-1 degree, the number stipulating UCAS points, are really at sort of at higher very long-term lows. Why do you think we're seeing this trend? What is it that's changing?
Well, I think partly partly to the above point is the candidates in the driving seat, and employers need to fill their vacancies. Because I think when I was at Carillion, I saw a stat that something like, this is probably 7 or 8 years ago, that a third of graduate vacancies went unfilled because the demands were too high. I stipulated 2-1 or whatever. And when we were at Carillion, we were at the early days, we dropped the degree classification straight away. And just anecdotally, it was just a case of, I guess it's lazy from an organizational point of view. It's the only thing you've got in order to sift out if it's manual. Whereas when you talk to your stakeholders, I'll give an example of a guy that ran our quantity surveying area, and he was, the first pass, whether they need a 2-1 from Manchester or wherever, university, insert here. When you got to the bones of it, I said, well, what does a good quantity surveyor look like and do? And he said, all he described was behaviours and some cognitive ability that was needed. And so I said, well, if we designed a process that could, ultimately get those candidates in front of you, what would that look like? It'd be brilliant. But I think it's partly the change. I think, the people driving that often graduate recruitment aren't experts in recruitment, so don't know. And also it's that what goes before, isn't it? I went to Manchester University and got a 2-1, so they must be like me, which we know isn't true. So I think there's a lot going on, and I think organisations are starting to wake up to your potential. I'm talking to someone that got a 2-2 degree, so obviously I'd be biased, but that it's just a mark in time, and it doesn't mean to say your degree is unnecessary. It just means that mark only reflects your ability to remember stuff, or on the day you might have performed better or worse than your peers, right?
Yeah, agreed. It's funny with them, we're getting asked a lot by the press at the moment around the whole marketing boycott. And I keep saying to journalists, actually, far fewer employers care about this than you think they do.
Yeah.
But the degree bit is such a small part of the process.
Yeah.
I did get a 2-1, really, because I was an older student. My A-level grades, I'll be far too embarrassed to even. I don't tell my daughter what they are, put it that way. It's just GCSEs. Same question to you, Tom, really. Are you seeing this trend in the work that you do, and what's your view on it?
Yeah, exactly the same trend. I think for quite some time, I think since I've been working in this space, we do occasionally speak to customers and say, oh, we've now dropped degree requirement, or we don't ask for certain things, or we don't ask for a CV or whatever it may be. And I think you're spot on, John, that it's often has been used as that kind of easy filter. It seemed to kind of make sense as like a proxy for how hardworking or smart is someone, because presumably if you get a good degree, that means you're smart and hardworking. I mean, anecdotally, we all knew people, maybe were those people at uni or school who never seemed to work but did really well, or you knew people who were really smart but were terrible at exams. There's a lot of factors actually at work here that might influence, as you said, that summarizing your degree, your 3 years in a single number. And I think it's something that in the more sort of academic or the IO practitioner space, we've been saying for a little while, right, that it is a poor predictor of job success, and it isn't something we should be putting a huge amount of focus on. But it has been a slow trend, I think, over the years, as organizations are, I think, waking up to the reality of that, but also because there are tools on the market that help you identify kind of the true value of skills that someone might have developed on a degree or elsewhere, on an apprenticeship, or going straight to the workplace. You don't need these kind of, slightly lazier proxies for it. Now, I think in fairness, in some areas, I think in more specialized areas, for example, I don't think anyone out there is going to say, oh, well, you no longer need a medical degree to become a doctor. I do, of course, think we have to be slightly cautious there. But I think for the most part, right, people realize that, it is quite limited. I do think, though, that the sudden trend and that sudden shift over to now being less than half looking for that 2-1 is probably again to the trends we've hinted at, right? People realizing, hey, we need to broaden that talent pool a little bit. And we've been restricting ourselves by saying you need a 2-1, or we only hire from Russell Group or Ivy League universities, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's interesting. I reflect on my previous recruiter days, and if somebody did a relevant degree, i.e. accounting and finance, you're going to be an accountant. And if you struggle with that qualification, that's probably a bit of an indicator that you might struggle with the actual role. So there's a relevance thing. I'd agree with that, Tom. So what would you say then to the person who says, because I have had this question asked me, well, that does just mean degrees are pointless then. What's the point in going to university? How would you answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly not. I wouldn't say to everyone, oh, hey, if you've got your finals tomorrow, don't worry about it, go out and have a few beers. Certainly, it's certainly not pointless. But, the university experience is around so much more than your performance on a final exam or a final piece of coursework. And I think, I certainly know from my time at university, it was a source of great stress, right? People, it was awful, right? People were so nervous about that final result. From the one exam could be the tipping point between one kind of or the other. And I think at a time when people are developing so much as individuals, you're socially, you're so involved with all these different people, all these new ideas coming to you. University exposes you to so many different areas. So to kind of say, hey, we're going to summarize an individual's 3-year experience at university based on a single number, I think you're realizing that that's kind of a poor way of looking at it, right? You don't want to discredit, I think, anyone who does do well and does well on exams. I mean, okay, yeah, that of course is a positive indicator. To say that something does the opposite is a negative indicator isn't quite right. So I think, yeah, I think organizations are realizing they can look for those other skills that people develop in other ways. The person who got a 2-1 but only spent the 3 or 3 years in the library versus someone who got a 2-2 but was involved in sport and did improv comedy, or was involved in sort of Model UN or those sort of things. They've developed all these other skills in areas which actually perhaps are more relevant than how they can regurgitate what was on their final exam. So I think I think organizations are realizing they've got the tools now to look at that, and those are the things that actually are more important.
Just John, just on that, sorry, a slight digression around that balance of slightly less frivolous question, I guess, around the value of a degree versus apprentice routes. Do you see employers starting to think more homogeneously? Actually, we don't really mind whether you've come through the apprentice or the degree route. Or do you still think there's significant differences in those when it comes to kind of the programs that you've run?
Well, can I speak the Balfour, for example, definitely more open-minded, and it's sort of, I guess it depends on the type of business you are, right? So, construction firm, very practical problem solving, in the here and now. So it's almost, it's horses for courses. I need an apprentice for that area to do that specific piece of work, and I develop to be that. I think you do need, to the earlier point about is the value of a degree and all of that. I think an educated workforce is a good thing, and whatever the degree you do, you would hope teaches you some critical thinking skills, which is perhaps the apprentice route doesn't necessarily. So I think it's easy to sort of say that it's not worth anything, but I think it is. But I think employers are starting to say there are different routes to skills, and it depends what you want, and I think graduate, and again, there's still a tension, in different businesses in that. So for a nationwide example, our graduate program, can't remember what we took on now, was meant to be a future leaders program, right? So we're developing you to be the future leadership of the organization in whatever form that took. Now, most business areas understood that, others didn't quite. I just want to train you to be an accountant. I don't want you to go do the sort of leadership stuff. So, and that then comes back to the form of assessment you use, right? Are you assessing for skill in job or potential and leadership potential, whatever it is, the set of potentials you're looking to sort of measure. So I think, but I think organizations are becoming more open to those routes, and I think they're seeing the value. I think the difficulty, having worked internally, it does create an industry inside, so you've got to really justify the cost or the investment of those programs, because it takes quite a lot to get the administration right, to match people up to courses, to make sure they're on the right learning provider, all of those things that are hidden costs to an organization, and if you're not a big organization with lots of funds, that can hamper those sort of initiatives.
Definitely. I've just seen we had a question pop in from Sam. Sam, we've got some time at the end for questions, so I'll save that to the end. But just a reminder to anybody else, if you've got questions for John or Tom, please pop them into the Q&A, and we'll come back to them at the end. John, just expanding on what you're saying there a little bit, can you just share some of your learnings around actually embedding new assessment selection methods? I guess share some of those outcomes that you've been able to achieve.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, key to it, I think, first of all, is what's the reason for change? So, what is the burning platform? Now, often that can be an efficiency or speed thing from an organizational point of view. Why are we trying to, put in some digital assessment? Yes, candidate experience is really important, but is it about, efficiency and experience, both for the external people, the candidates, but also your teams? Can you make better value jobs internally? And also, what quality outcome are you trying to get? So that stakeholder engagement is really important. The example I gave earlier of, what is a good insert quantity surveyor in any role, what are the key elements to be successful in that role, and work with the stakeholders to define that? Because I think there's often a bit of, as recruiters, we're easily kind of blinded by the tech and the science, and we want to make it easy, for ourselves, rightly so. But what you don't understand, I think, is the business, the operation. They've got lots of knowledge that they can't necessarily articulate in easily into an assessment process, and these tools help you do that. So you've got to get alongside them and get them to articulate that, because what you're really doing is saying, Mr. Engineer, Mrs. Engineer, you are defining what good looks like. All we're doing is finding a better route to assess some of those elements, and to get you, the top 10, 20% in front of you at an assessment event, interview, whatever you're using, with a structured process to give you the best chance of a good outcome, right? You're de-risking the process and making it more efficient and a positive experience for everybody. So I say the change and the change management and the stakeholder engagement and communication is key. And give you some examples with Nationwide. Like anybody, like any organization at the time, struggling to recruit tech skills and females into tech. Of the cohort that we had a program that wasn't a grad program, it was a skills program, and it was based on potential, and cognitive potential was one of the key driving indicators. And we managed to fill a cohort of, I think 20, I think 12 were women, based on, it was just based on they scored better on those skills tests, ability tests that we designed with a provider than others. And the previous iteration that year before, out of 20, I think 4 got through. So you can do it, but it takes a bit of thinking and a bit of planning. And it's not, and I think the other thing to think is plan it backwards. What outcome, you've always got a window of grad or apprentice recruitment, normally being September, October time. So think backwards of when you need to do the work, because it always takes longer than you think. So the vendors, HireVue, present company accepted, any standard tech vendor will say it's 16 weeks. I mean, that may or may not be true from their side, but often the blockers, this is not a criticism of them, is internally. Herding the cats is the hardest thing internally rather than externally. So always allow more time, a cushion to do it and get it over the line than you think you need, because it will always overrun, and you probably want to build in a bit of slack anyway.
Yeah, I'd second that. I can certainly comment on kind of the vendor side.
Yeah.
We typically say more like sort of 6 to 8 weeks for a new implementation.
Yeah.
But the number of times we get someone turn around and say, "Oh, hey, we're going live in 2 weeks. Can you do this?"
Yeah.
And we're like, "Well, you guys are going to have a lot to do. You probably should have thought of this."
The business don't always do what they're told, do they? So
and have some key measures. I think at Nationwide and Carillion, to be fair, a lot of the measures were around diverse outcomes, getting greater diversity through the pipe. Now that may or may not be true in other organizations, but have some key metrics that you can point to, because don't expect it to be 100% smooth. Some people will complain, some people will have a bad experience for whatever reason and be prepared to manage it.
Yeah, agreed. Tom, can I just we started talking a little bit about sort of skills-based hiring, and actually John mentioned hiring for potential, actually, which is the question that Sam was getting to in the Q&A. So there's a lot of talk about skills-based hiring at the moment. Again, can you share what you're seeing from your conversations with your customers around this whole skills piece?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk around a lot of hype around skills at the moment, kind of skills being that new talent currency. And look, kind of fundamentally, there's nothing that new here. It's not like we've uncovered some new element of the human psyche that we can now assess that we didn't know about before. Really, a large part of it is reframing the conversation and reframing how we view both sort of gaps in an organization, and then also the candidates or the talent that actually goes on to fill that. It's really about defining, look, what is the gap? So what do we need to do more of? What are the actions, the duties, the responsibilities we need more of, or we are now missing? And then what are the skills that are going to enable people to do that job more effectively? Yeah, I think for a long time, there's been more of a focus on more, again, kind of slightly more arbitrary measures. Hey, we're missing a bunch of accountants or project managers. Let's just put a job advert saying we need accountants, 3 years experience, and that'll do the rest. And we're realizing now that organizations, people, roles are more complex than that. And so viewing people a little bit differently is important. We did some quite interesting research, or can't take credit, our data science team did, where they stripped all this information from ONET. So it's like an online database of lots of information around, I think about 1,200 different job roles. It includes activities they do and skills and capabilities. And they kind of did this very nice sort of cluster analysis. They kind of mapped them together based on kind of similarities in the underlying skills that were listed on the job descriptions. And it was really interesting because you got job types that you wouldn't expect to actually start to cluster together. You had teachers, kind of solution consultants, so your pre-sales folk, and nurses, all aligned really closely together on these kind of axes. And when you start to look at it, you realize actually there is some really fundamental overlap in these seemingly different roles, right? A large part of, particularly a teacher and a solution consultant, nurses do a heck of a lot of other stuff as well, is really about taking a topic or a product or a service and articulating it in a number of different ways to a number of different audiences with different levels of understanding, levels of engagement, or whatever it may be. And that's kind of almost at the very core of what they're doing is explaining and it's educating on something. And I said nurses do a lot of other stuff as well, but you're having to explain to people who are potentially ill, in a state of distress, really nice and clearly some complex terminology and complex concepts. And so again, not to, that's just kind of a way of sort of bring it to life a little bit. If you're saying, hey, we've lost our solution consultant, we need some more pre-sales folk or whatever it may be, rather than saying, well, we need someone with 2 years experience in this field, if you actually define the role based on what you need them to do, what skills they need to bring, you're going to find potentially high talent in those other areas and places you may not have kind of previously considered. I think then when you look at that piece around potential, a large part of that really does come down to kind of some of those softer skills, right? There's more behavioral qualities, those personal attributes. And I think that's particularly relevant in the early careers in the graduate space, right? Because the harder skills, the technical knowledge, and the industry expertise, that's probably what you want people to learn and develop as they go through your program, whether it's a rotation-based, 1, 2, 3 year, whatever it may be. You want to hire people who have, I guess, the predisposition to make the most of that experience, because actually you're going to equip them with the hard skills and the knowledge about your organization and your industry throughout the course of that program. So and that's certainly a focus we've done. We put a big focus on the softer skills because we think that that's the value add from the assessment process, particularly within the early talent space.
So where does the science come into that, Tom? The science, you're building a structured selection process to create that effective hiring approach.
Yeah, I mean, it comes throughout it, right? You've got to make sure you're implementing the right thing, make sure what you're implementing aligns and is rigorous and is validated, and making sure that you kind of use those outcomes effectively. Understanding of what the role or the roles entail. Again, for a grad program, not all grad programs are equal. Are they going to change team every 3 months, every 6 months? Are they going to go to one area? Does everyone go through the same process? I think it's important that organizations do review how these shift and change over time, make sure that's reflected in what you're looking for when you hire candidates. I think, yeah, it's one of those things that seems to happen every few years. Companies we work with might say, oh, we really haven't changed it for a few years, it's time to review it. And you kind of think, well, how much has happened in those few years? You know, one year to another, inadvertently, the structure can change and you don't perhaps reflect that in the hiring process. So as I said, I think making sure that what you're assessing candidates on for these grad programs aligns to expectations of the program itself is really it's kind of really important. I think John hit the nail on the head of the whole change management piece. That's a big part of certainly what I do, or what we do with customers, and I think any organization will be doing is getting the different stakeholders on board, especially where you've got those graduates who are hired to be future leaders and are now future leaders who perhaps are slightly holding on to, I don't know if it's nostalgia or it's just kind of, well, this is how I had to do it, so that should be the way that everyone should have to do it. I don't know what the attachment sometimes is, but getting them on board, well, okay, this is now why we're moving to this approach. This is the value of it. Starting top down and working through those steps is quite a challenge. I'm having a bit of a chat, or I've had a challenge that recently with an organization where the kind of senior lead has a real attachment to a tool that is essentially not designed for assessment selection. It's not Myers-Briggs. We don't need to stand here and bash it again, but it's a similar tool. He really holds on to this profile that he got from that tool, but having to bring them around to, well, that's okay, but you actually need to shift your focus to this because we're aligning it to actually the cognitive skills, the personal traits, the behavioral qualities that are required to be successful in the job, rather than something that's more of a informative sort of development type piece. I think the last one on that is really around the importance and the need for consistency. So working out, what are we going to do? What are the steps? What are the criteria? What are kind of your, not necessarily pass mark, but how are you going to use the scores to make decisions? And then applying it consistently. So not only your purely external candidates, you probably won't get many internal candidates, I suspect, for graduate hiring, but more your referrals. I suspect some people on this call probably have gone through the grief of someone in the business, perhaps someone senior, refers their son or daughter or their friend's son or daughter, and they don't do well, and then they say, well, hold on a minute, there's something wrong because my Jimmy's excellent. I know he's excellent. He should have passed this process. And you kind of, they sometimes perhaps forget they might have brought in this process to bring structure and bring consistency. So I think making sure that everyone is aligned on, well, these are the criteria, and you've got to meet these criteria in order to be accepted onto the program. We were actually just in Switzerland last week and chatting with some of the TA leads for companies we work with, and one of them actually said, I was quite surprised to hear that every single role in their organization, whether it's the entry level, so graduate hiring, or even just promotions within the team, has to be applied for, and it's opened up to everyone. So they no longer just say, oh, well, Tom and his team, he's been doing well, he should step up into the new manager role. I would have to apply for it along with anyone else from the team or externally who wants to go for it. And they trust the process. They set the criteria and they take the best candidate based on those criteria. They remove that more subjective, well, we know Tom, we like Tom, we think he's great, hopefully. And I think that's a much more scientific way of doing it, although I suspect the change management there was probably quite tricky for them.
Yeah, I guess so. John, can I just pick up that bit on this hiring potential, hiring for skills? It's always been my view, rightly or wrongly, that the UK actually is a very generic market, a bit different to Europe. Maybe that's something we can get on to if we've got time towards the end. But I guess it's different for different sectors. So financial services, my background, actually you tend to be relatively agnostic about a degree subject. I'd imagine, construction, Balfour Beatty, you need structural engineers, QS, you need QS roles. So what's your take on this balance between actually what you may have studied specifically being relevant or irrelevant, and it's the skills and potential that come first?
I think it's a dose of pragmatism, isn't it? I think I think you referenced it earlier that if you need to be a doctor or an engineer, you need a medical degree. Well, to be an engineer, so in Balfour, for example, or Carillion, to be a civil engineer, you know, that 3 or 4 year degree is quite important, right? So it takes about 6 or 7 years to become a fully fledged engineer. So to say we can train you from scratch, which you might do from an apprenticeship route, but actually having some of those skills and knowledge, okay, it might take that civil engineer six months to sort of pick up the practical, you know, ways of life in a big company, but you can get them up to speed. But I think we would still be overlaying that with some level of behavioral and cognitive ability on what works within your organizational context. So to sort of to Tom's point, you know, you wouldn't be one size fits all for all roles. The assessment, you might tailor it to, you know, for engineering roles, it might be dial up on one thing like cognitive ability, and for other roles, HR, marketing, comms, it might, you know, you might dial up to the more behavioral, maybe it depends, but I think it does depend on the context of your organization and what you need and what, you know, what outcomes you need ultimately. But I think that they have to have a heavy dose of pragmatism. You know, what does work? You can have a theory and you can have sort of great ideas, but unless you really do have like a blank canvas of a role, well, you really don't need to have a degree in, I don't know, marketing, for example, to be a marketeer in company X. It's just about learning the skills. Then you've got to have a practical approach to, you know, ultimately filling the gaps that you've got. And it does go back to Tom's point earlier about, you know, this, you know, everyone's buzzword at the moment, workforce planning, but some element of planning, and, you know, not to get worried by it, because on a practical level, you know, an easy example, at Nationwide, when I first joined, there was just a conversation between, you know, on one level, a conversation between a hiring manager saying, do you know, it used to be, how many graduates do you want? I don't want any. It was as you know, basic as that. And then when you say, well, you don't want any, but these roles over here take you up to 6 months to recruit, and they're really expensive, and, you know, and then all that goes with it. And they're like, oh, so if we had someone we trained for 2 years, by 18 months, 2 years, they'd probably be up to, you go, yeah, well, maybe that's true, right? So I think that workforce planning, you can make it as difficult or as complex as you need it to be, but there has to be an element of planning, I think, around skills. So, you know, to Tom's point, what are you lacking, and what is your future business? What might you be lacking? Don't think about the roles, but what skills? And then when you come back to it, you go, okay, we might need to recruit one graduate digital design engineer, right? You know, because we're going to lack this. But don't get hung up on, you know, it's too difficult, in the too difficult box. There are practical conversations to be had that can lead you into that.
Yeah, I think we should run a competition for who can reinvent a different name to workforce planning.
Exactly. Yeah.
I just conjure it as a spreadsheet. It's not what it should be about. It's tools to be far more strategic.
And I'll give you an example. BP, I was at a talk recently, BP, who are going through a huge shift from, you know, oil and gas to, you know, green energy. They have a head of workforce planning. You know, he's been around for a couple of years, and he said, look, don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. We've got a burning platform literally to sort of shift, you know, all of this stuff, and it's a bit scary, but don't think you have to get it 100% right, and don't stop doing it, because it is just a process of learning, really.
Yeah, and it's a long time, and time gets in the way of these things as well. So exactly, you're right, you can't totally predict what you're going to be in 5 years.
No.
Just going back to a little bit, John, you were talking about, and this probably applies to actually trying to get some elements of workforce planning. It applies to actually what Tom was talking about, selection tools, etc. And you talked a bit before about the challenges of sort of winning the business over and getting them engaged. Kind of, what's your approach to those stakeholders, and how do you take them on the journey with you?
I think the starting point is, you know, what do you want out of this? What does good look like for you, and, you know, and as both as an individual, but then as a collective level? So what are we seeing, and understand what you want from that apprenticeship program or graduate sort of hires. So really spend time to understand, and I think in most cases, you know, again, the practical might be line in the sand. They've got to have an engineering, they've got to have some sort of knowledge of engineering. Well, fine, so we're not going to throw the baby out of the bathwater, but what else? Then, you know, describe to me a good engineer in Balfour Beatty. What do they do? What do they sound like? What are they, you know? And you will come back to elements of behavioral, teamwork, you know, whatever they are, that you can then start to build and test a sort of a process of saying, well, if they were like this, and then you introduce the tool, the tools that, and then you can say, look, I can industrialize this, right? So my team don't have to sift through thousands of CVs that are irrelevant, you know, or we're just making a very poor judgment based on a CV. And, you know, you can test that out in your project, you know, project plan to say, look, you know, if some of your team, if you're saying that these elements are right and people are successful, you can test it out on a bunch of internal folk who've come through the program in the previous 1, 2, 3 years, right? And you can actually say, well, look, these guys have done really well. Be careful there, because if the managers take those tests, they might fail them, right? They might not do very well on them because they're managers, right? So be prepared for that. But I think it's just show them that there's no, I think what often happens is the managers think there's some kind of dark art to this. And this is, you know, it's not, it is practical, it's based on scientific, you know, well-researched material. And it's just a better way of getting people through your funnel and giving them a better experience. And overall, the hiring manager say, look, you're only going to have to turn up to one assessment event or interview or whatever to get your hires, rather than, you know, perhaps having some 2 or 3 and getting a, you know, a 4 in 10 hit rate rather than an 8 in 10 hit rate, which is what everyone wants, right? And the candidates can get some feedback immediately, even the unsuccessful ones. So think of your brand as well, is that worst case, you know, a candidate will go through that assessment at that point and get some feedback within 48 hours, right? Now, it might not be right, you know, they get rejected, but at least they get something, right? Whereas in a manual, old-fashioned process, they might not, well, really bad, they might not hear anything, so, you know, really bad, or they might wait 3, 4, 5, 6 months before they get any kind of clarity, which, you know, again, is probably worse, right? So because they put all that effort in to apply to you and you know, take some interest in you, and you can only, you know, at Balfour, I think we got 15,000 applications for 500 roles a year. So you go, you're going to disappoint 14,500 people. Well, you better get good at disappointing people, I think, because, you know, at some point in that industry, you know, they probably will come back to us when they're an experienced hire, because it's a limited industry, right? You know, there's only few contractors of that size and scale out there that, you know, so if they go, well, at least they treat them with some dignity, I'll apply for them in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time, right?
Yeah, agreed. You can say no to people with dignity, can't you? Because you're right. Otherwise, you're just running a rejection machine and you're annoying and all that. I mean, they could be potential customers. You know,
exactly.
They could be buying homes at some point down the line, and there always those little, you know, we can all share our experience of either bad service or, you know, we applied for a job, weren't treated well, and we will have a negative view of that organisation. That's quite hard to come on. Sorry, Tom, were you trying to come in there?
Yeah, I was going to say, when you're spot on there. I mean, we often were redesigning a process for customers. We talk about this idea of designing for the disappointed. As you said, 95% of people aren't going to get the job. So ultimately, they're going to be disappointed. But what can you do to make it a worthwhile experience for them? And particularly for grads, in that, I think that feedback is a key one. We implemented an insights report for candidates, and that was a big drive, because this could be one of the first, you know, hiring experiences candidates, so graduate candidates, have had. I think they're probably more critical. They're going to take it more personally, their first couple of rejections. But then equally, getting coaching, getting feedback on where they were strong and where they could work to improve, I think is something they're really going to value. So yeah, there's a lot of different things to make sure that, as you said, those who don't get the job still actually view you as a positive light.
I'm conscious of time, so we have got that Sam's question to get to, and a couple of others that we might get from the audience as well. So if you're listening and you do want to ask a question, we've still got some time to drop those in. But just before we get to that, I thought we need to cover the topic of AI. You know, it's a very hot subject in our industry at the moment. Just coming to you first of all, Tom. You know, we could have a whole series of webinars on AI. You know, have you got any sort of quick 101 stuff around AI is used in hiring tools? Any apprehensions out there that people can overcome in this sector? Anything that we need to debunk in terms of myths about AI?
I think a big one is this idea that kind of all AI kind of is the same, or that, you know, AI is still kind of what we associate with sort of science fiction films, where it's, you know, has the capacity to, you know, take over the human race, right? AI comes in all shapes, sizes, degrees of autonomy, degrees of outputs, etc. You have distinctions like, is it a static or a dynamic system? So is it boxed up? Is it static? It doesn't change, or does it evolve over time? is it supervised or is it unsupervised? So kind of is there human oversight, checking in kind of what it does and labeling that data? And yeah, I think certainly within our space, the majority is going to be both static and supervised. It has a lot of control. There are guardrails in place. That's the more risk-averse, I guess, spectrum of AI versus being dynamic and unsupervised, i.e. it just takes all the data it can, it learns whatever it wants, however it can, and the human basically has no understanding of that. That's the kind of stuff that ends up in science fiction films and, as I said, sort of disaster movies. But for the most part, especially in the hiring space, there's so much regulation, there's so much compliance, there's so many ethical guidelines put in place that you kind of need to dissociate the two. It is very controlled when organizations are implementing AI-based kind of recruitment technologies. And I think the other big sort of myth to be debunked is this whole idea of is AI taking jobs? Is it replacing recruits, etc.? It's a complete myth that AI is kind of doing everything. It really is about augmenting the human. It works with the human decision-making process. I could certainly say that none of the organizations we work with at HireVue have a hiring process where a candidate goes through the entire process without ever having contact or being reviewed by a human. It just doesn't happen. We're a long way, I think, off from that if we ever really get to that point. So your customers we work with, they tend to crawl before they walk, before they run, right? As they build confidence, they go through that change management piece. Obviously, building up, the more you let it automate those mundane tasks, scheduling interviews, sending follow-up emails, etc., you're reducing that time to fill. You're freeing up time for your recruiters to do more interesting and value-add stuff. But not all AI is created equal, and nor is it leveraged in the same way. So apprehension is always welcome, but there are controls in place, certainly.
Have you got any tips on how to use it effectively for somebody who's coming, who's thinking about sort of using AI for the first time?
Yes, I think sticking to the fundamentals, and what I mean by that is AI in itself is not a tool. If someone says, "Oh, hey, we're now going to start using AI," the next question would be, well, how or where or to what end, right? It's, oh, we're going to bring AI into a hiring process, or we're going to use an AI-based tool for our engagement surveys or for our people analytics. It's kind of attached to something where it powers something else. And so don't let the fact that, oh, it's using some interesting, exciting AI kind of detract from the fact that the tool itself still has to serve a purpose that you have a need for. You are implementing the same ways or the same way, but holding to the same standards if AI wasn't there, and you're using the outputs to a useful kind of extent, right? We can't kind of lose track of that and just get excited by the newest sort of shiny tool out in the marketplace. So I think, I think that's kind of the key thing just to remember. Stick to the fundamentals.
I think I'd add something there, Stephen. I think if you just replaced AI and called it automation, then I don't think people would get so worked up. And that's, in the digital assessment place, I mean, there is AI enablement, but it's really about automation. It's about automating some volume processes in many cases that need it. And I think, if you take it back, I don't know, 15 years to when some of these tools weren't as digitized or as technology enabled, there was still like, oh, it's the dark art and I'm scared, but it's like it was doing the same job. It was just a different algorithm or a manual algorithm, really. So I think it's, how do you explain it? And for anybody implementing the tools, regardless of AI or not, is make friends with your DPO. I don't think I'd ever say that in a recruitment event, but your data protection officer now, especially, and more really about the providers. I hate to use the Brexit word, but what the practical stuff of where your servers are located, all of those things are really quite important in this in this space. So your DPO, as part of that stakeholder engagement, is a key stakeholder. Get them on board early, because there's normally only one or two of them and they're very busy.
Yes. And it might feel bureaucratic, but it is important. It's not stuff to be ignored. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Just thinking about from the candidate's point of view on the AI piece, actually, because there's so much talk about ChatGPT. Are you both relatively comfortable with actually the way that ChatGPT might develop and how it may or may not affect recruitment tools, or do you see this kind of, you know, the next 6 months we're going to see radical change? Because we see, I hear the conversation from both points of view, actually, closed systems, open systems, etc. So I just wonder what your take on that was.
I think, bizarrely, I think it might, I don't think it will radically change within 6 months, but I think it'll hasten the need for more assessment tools like this, because of an anecdotal example, I had a friend of mine was interviewing someone, he works in the tech space, who he could tell was going on to chat GPT to get the answer, you know, it's a competency-based interview. So, and he called him out on it. And you think, well, if people are starting to gain that, then we need more of these tools that are a bit more robust. You know, you can't, you know, a lot of the digital assessment tools on the market, including HireVue, will protect you against kind of gaming that answer or whatever, because of the way they work internally, so you don't get served up with the same questions in the same format all the time. So I think it might hasten that on, and hasten employers to think about, what is it going about people who can perform an interview, or is it they've got a deeper set of, you know, potential and expertise.
What's your take on
Yeah,
that, Tom?
I mean, with 8 minutes to go, got to kind of really bullet point it. But yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, you know, we're not unconcerned. Of course, we've run our own tests when we looked at performs. I think, to John's point, some of the more softer skill elements where it's attitude, would you prefer this, do you prefer that? Some of those there's less kind of black and white, right or wrong type assessments that we provide. Certainly, GPT is not significantly changing the game there right now. And there's certainly things we can do, and we are doing, to kind of mitigate against that, both in terms of sort of low tech approaches. Calling someone out is one approach, right, I guess, but there's certainly things that we're advising customers on how they can mitigate against it. But I think you're spot on. Really, what it's more likely to do is to slightly change the trajectory of this space. I think all assessment vendors, as well as companies implementing hiring processes, that trajectory will have changed a little bit, because it's now a consideration, especially if we continue to see or we see widespread adoption of those tools. It's going to be a big one. But at the same time, when I had a webinar on this just earlier today, I kind of said, look, in the day, people kind of, the naysayers, those sort of spreading doom and gloom, kind of seem to almost forget that no one out there ever said that virtual online assessments were infallible, right? Oh yeah, they predict with perfect accuracy. There's no way to cheat or game them. I mean, ever since phone screens have existed, you could always get someone else to take the phone screen for you, or your mate who's got a PhD, get them to help with the cognitive tests. But you know, assessments still in real application are shown to be true, valid, accurate predictors. You know, maybe it creates a bit of noise. You get the odd false positive, but the average candidate generally is more honest or maybe fearful of being called out or caught than we like to think. So yeah, we're not digging our heads in the sand and saying, oh, we don't need to worry about it, but we're not too concerned where it is right now. And of course, as it continues to grow, so will we. And we expect, it shift trajectories a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, on, you know, recruitment is, you know, we've all made bad recruitment decisions. You know, it is not, you know, you can de-risk it, and you can, but sometimes also you've got to take risk on candidates, don't you? You know, there isn't a perfect computer system that will tell you, yes, that's the 100% right decision. I think you're right. We forget that sometimes. We've got a few minutes left, so if anybody has got a question, do pop it into the chat, into the Q&A, as I said. Sam asked this question about recruiting for potential as opposed to the finished product, which I think we kind of covered an element of that, but it did make me think about the EDI angle. And John, you mentioned earlier about the tech roles where you change the process and you've got a much better gender split. It made me think about candidates from more disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds who may not have the peer support, and that bit where they do maybe meet somebody from the business in an interview format, or where that superficial polish can come over. Any thoughts around actually how that hides potential, how you make sure that, I guess, potential is seen as genuine potential? Actually, it's not masked because somebody's got the polish. It looks like the potential when they might not do.
Oh, could have a webinar on this, couldn't you? I think in really short term, I think the tests can help, but they're one element, because they can show against, you know, if you've done your research and the change management, it can show potential. I think there's other elements that organizations need to do to prep or help candidates generally navigate their assessment process processes, so for example, preparing, so nationwide we ran online webinars for, especially around the apprentice level, because it was more about age and experience, where they used as the first assessment event they'd had an intervention in. So can you help them understand that there's nothing scary, we just want you to talk about you, and and there's no kind of hidden agenda, and in order to encourage them to apply and stick with the application. I think then I think the deeper question that is probably one for another time is, what organizations do you work with to do outreach for you if you're worried about it? Because I think there are structural barriers to employment for certain hard to reach groups that you as an organization, unless you're really well resourced or really forward looking, won't have either the resource or expertise to navigate that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Somebody else doing some work with challenged my thinking, actually saying that putting too much on the individual to approach it, you've got to think about some of those structures out there in organisations that can work around those structures. Any thoughts from you, Tom, on that subject?
Yeah, and I think as I said, the more socioeconomic element, I think, is an important part of it, right? And I think that is what certain tools out there are going to really help with. I think, I know without going too deep into ChatGPT as a tangent, but I think it's going to be interesting to see if GPT helps eliminate kind of that, helps further eliminate, dare I say it, the CV and the cover letter. I mean, I know a lot of organizations who say are removing degree requirements, but some are going beyond that and saying we don't require a CV, we'll just give you some bio data, tell us factual yes or no, you've got this certification, this qualification, or whatever that may be. Because again, we just know that demographic can play so much into your CV and your cover letter, how well it's presented, how much preparation you've received, your written communication, all these factor in, when in reality, actually what it's meant to be is an indication of your experience, your relevant experience, and your kind of motivation. So I think that, certainly a lot of tools are going to be broadening our horizons from a D&I perspective beyond the usual age, gender, ethnicity. I think there's other elements that they can be supporting with as well. Right, we're nearly at time, so I'm going to ask you for one quick pithy. We covered a lot of ground. We've ended up on AI, and we started talking about more generally around degree classifications, etc. So and everything in between. So out of the whole conversation today, have each of you got kind of like a one thing you'd like the audience to take away, that will that really help them effectively drive early career hiring in their organisations?
I would just say, understand what you want your sort of initial outcomes to be, and then it's a bit of a process of evolution. So don't expect to fix everything at once, because that's because everyone will be disappointed, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right?
Very good. Tom, what's your tip?
I think repeating what I said earlier, stick to the fundamentals. I think with any tool, but certainly from a hiring perspective, it doesn't matter how flashy or how shiny it looks. Look at the research on the validity, the reliability, published research, what it actually does and the value it brings, rather than how you think aesthetically it looks. You owe that to the hiring managers who are going to get these candidates. You owe it to the candidates themselves who are either going to be rightly or wrongly selected. So stick to the fundamentals.
Got it. So stick to the fundamentals and expect an iterative process to evolve as you go along. Fantastic. Two great points to end on. John, Tom, thanks a huge amount. That's we've covered, like I said, an awful lot of ground. We've been talking for an hour, so I'm sure we could keep on talking a lot longer, particularly some of the subjects that we started to touch on. Thanks very much, Tom, to you and your team at HireVue for pulling all this together and doing all the work in the background. That's very much appreciated. We couldn't put on a lot of content without support from organisations like you. John, thanks for all your insights. Lots of great experience you brought to bear there from a number of organisations. As I said at the start, this has been recorded. You will get a recording on an email plus some additional resources from HireVue. Any other questions, any thoughts, please, we're all on LinkedIn, or just ping me a note at the ISE and I'll pass them on to Tom and John. So thanks for all your time. Hope you have a really enjoyable rest of the day. Talk to you all soon. Thanks, John. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.